On the 1st of May, 1982, 32 men stepped out of helicopters onto an occupied island and disappeared. No announcement, no support within range. The helicopters flew back to the task force 120 miles away across the South Atlantic, and the men simply ceased to exist as far as anyone could see. Below them stretched treeless moorland, peat bogs, rock and wind and cold, and 30,000 Argentine soldiers who did not know they had arrived. The men dug shallow scrapes in the frozen ground, pulled camouflage chicken wire over themselves, and lay still. They would stay there for weeks. The war they were about to shape from inside those holes in the earth has never been properly told. Tell me in the comments if you had heard of any of this before today, because what you are about to discover was kept out of the official story of how Britain won the Falklands War. Watch until the end. The last chapter belongs to a man who walked toward the fire so that someone else could run, and the enemy who buried him with full military honors and asked that his own government recognize what he had done. To understand why those 32 men were lying in the dark on an occupied island, you first have to understand the calculation that sent them there, and the one variable nobody in Buenos Aires had adequately measured. The 2nd of April, 1982. Argentine armed forces executed Operation Rosario, a full-scale amphibious invasion of the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory 8,000 miles from London, populated by fewer than 2,000 people of almost entirely British descent who had been there for 150 years. The island's garrison consisted of 68 Royal Marines, 11 naval hydrographers, and 23 volunteers of the Falkland Islands Defense Force. They fought for several hours at Government House before Governor Sir Rex Hunt ordered Major Mike Norman to cease fire and surrender. The Falkland Islands fell in a morning. General Leopoldo Galtieri, the junta's leader, had constructed his invasion on a foundation of domestic necessity. Argentina's economy was in crisis. His regime's human rights record had generated international revulsion. The dirty war had produced tens of thousands of disappeared citizens, and the political situation was deteriorating by the month. His advisors assured him that seizing Las Malvinas would bury the regime's problems under a flood of nationalist pride. The calculation also rested on a strategic assessment shared, implicitly, by British defense analysts for years. That military recapture of the Falklands from 8,000 miles of open ocean, with no nearby base, no pre-positioned assets, and no contingency plan, was simply not feasible. The strategic logic of abandonment seemed overwhelming. The calculation contained one catastrophic variable that nobody in Buenos Aires had adequately measured: Margaret Thatcher. Within days of the invasion, the British cabinet authorized a naval task force, a carrier group, requisitioned civilian vessels, paratroopers, Royal Marines, and the full institutional weight of a government that had decided the alternative was worse than the undertaking. No rehearsed operation, no contingency plan. The task force sailed on the 5th of April with 100 ships and the iron will of a prime minister who did not find the logic of abandonment overwhelming in the slightest. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward commanded from his flagship HMS Hermes. Brigadier Julian Thompson commanded the ground forces of 3 Commando Brigade. Already aboard those ships, already heading south, were the 2 SAS squadrons that would shape the campaign before a single conventional soldier set foot on East Falkland soil. The problem that made what the SAS was about to attempt not merely dangerous, but necessary, was the near-total absence of intelligence. Argentine troop dispositions were unknown. Their strengths were unknown. Their equipment was unknown. The landing site for the British assault had not been chosen. Without reliable intelligence, the task force was sailing toward an armed occupation with almost no understanding of where anything was. Before a single ship could come within 50 miles of the Falklands, someone had to go and look. That task fell to G Squadron. 8 four-man patrols lifted from the task force by helicopter on the night of the 1st of May, 120 miles from the islands. The men inside carried everything they would need for an extended stay behind enemy lines: food, water, communications equipment, weapons, and ammunition, enough to fight their way out if the worst happened. The helicopters touched down, the men stepped off, and the aircraft flew back. For all practical purposes, those 32 men had ceased to exist. The Falkland Islands at night offer concealment for a rabbit and nothing larger. The landscape is treeless moorland, rolling in shallow undulations across which the wind moves without interruption from Antarctica. No hedgerows, no forest, no buildings in the open country, nothing above knee height for miles in every direction. Moving across this terrain in daylight would have been suicide. The G Squadron patrols moved only at night, slow and deliberate, reading the ground by feel as much as sight, finding positions before dawn and then going to ground entirely. Their concealment technique was as primitive as anything devised in any war. Shallow scrapes dug into the peat, men lying flat inside them, camouflaged chicken wire pulled over the top. They became part of the landscape. Argentine patrols moved within meters of their positions and never looked down. From inside those holes, they watched and reported. Argentine unit positions, strengths, and dispositions flowed back to HMS Hermes through encrypted radio traffic. The intelligence picture that the entire landing plan depended on was being assembled by men lying in freezing mud on an occupied island, invisible to the occupation force moving around them. One patrol established an observation post inside the rusting iron hull of the Lady Elizabeth, a 3-masted sailing bark launched in Sunderland in 1879, beached in Whalebone Cove at the eastern end of Stanley Harbor since 1936. From inside the corroded ribs of a Victorian sailing ship in the middle of the Argentine-occupied capital, British soldiers reported on enemy ship and aircraft movements for weeks. The Lady Elizabeth still sits there today, in the cove where she drifted when her mooring lines broke during a storm 86 years ago, carrying in her hull the memory of a patrol that made her one of the stranger observation posts in the history of modern intelligence collection. Other patrols located Argentine helicopter concentrations dispersed across the islands, the heavy-lift aircraft being used to move forces and supplies across ground that had no roads. RAF Harrier jets were guided in on precise coordinates, and the helicopters burned on the grass where they had been dispersed. Argentina's ability to move forces rapidly around East Falkland by air was being dismantled by men who were supposed to be doing nothing more than watching. A patrol overlooking Goose Green called in a Harrier strike on the fuel and ammunition dump there, and the column of fire confirmed what the patrol had already reported about the garrison's logistical significance. Sergeant J.G. Mather of G Squadron, Royal Signals attached, commanded a 4-man patrol inserted onto East Falkland on the 1st of May. His citation records that he maintained continuous observations of Argentine movement and dispositions in the Bluff Cove and West Stanley areas for 28 days. In a totally hostile environment, with the only protection from ground and air search provided by the skill and stealth of his patrol. 28 days, longer than most soldiers spend in a forward area in an entire deployment, in a hole in the ground. The Argentine forces that controlled the ground around him never found him, one forward patrol, moving carefully across the high ground west of Stanley, found something the Argentine command had apparently failed to notice was exposed. Mount Kent, 1,093 feet above East Falkland, 5 miles west of Stanley, dominant over every approach route to the Argentine defensive perimeter around the capital, was largely undefended. The Heliborne Reserve stationed in the area had been flown south to Goose Green. The regiment tasked with the ground had shifted to different positions. The mountain that controlled the road to the end of the war was standing there, essentially empty. The patrol reported it. Nobody in the Argentine garrison appeared to notice they had made a catastrophic error. That report sat in the intelligence accumulation on HMS Hermes, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. That understanding would come. But first, the story requires a step back to explain who G Squadron were, what doctrine they carried, and what they had already done before the central chapter of this account had properly begun. The regiment that arrived in the South Atlantic carried a doctrine unchanged in its essentials, since it was conceived in a hospital bed in Alexandria in the summer of 1941. David Sterling, a junior officer who had partially paralyzed himself in an unauthorized parachute jump, spent his recovery sketching a plan. The Axis powers in North Africa maintained dozens of airfields, each with dozens of aircraft, each requiring skilled ground crew, fuel, armaments, and maintenance that took weeks to replace. If small teams of highly trained men could reach those airfields silently and plant incendiary devices on the aircraft themselves, they could achieve with 6 men and a handful of explosives what entire air forces could not achieve from altitude. By the end of the war, his men had destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa alone. Within the regiment, there is a tradition that gives the measure of the institution's relationship with loss. The names of soldiers who die on duty are inscribed on a clock tower at the regimental barracks in Hereford. Those whose names appear there are said to have failed to beat the clock. It is a formulation that carries no false comfort and no theatrical grief, only the quiet acknowledgement that in the Special Air Service, the clock is always running. Major Cedric Norman George Delves was born on the 1st of March, 1947, in Singapore. Commissioned from the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, into the Devonshire and Dorset Regiment in August of 1968, he earned 2 mentions in dispatches during tours in Northern Ireland, passed selection for the SAS, and by the spring of 1982 was commanding D Squadron at 35 years old. He described the entire Falklands campaign in his memoir as a come-as-you-are party. No rehearsal, no contingency planning, no institutional preparation. What his squadron brought instead was the willingness to improvise at a pace that outran the enemy's ability to respond. The man he would depend on most to execute that improvisation was a different kind of officer, younger and more directly physical, carrying a record that already defied easy summary. Captain Gavin John Hamilton was born on the 15th of May, 1953, in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. He had graduated from Sandhurst into the Green Howards, served in Cyprus, Belize, and South Armagh during Operation Banner, and in 1981 transferred to the SAS at his own request, taking command of 19 Mountain Troop. He was 28 years old when Argentina invaded. D Squadron was at war before most of the task force had cleared British waters. In April, on the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia, 900 miles southeast of the Falklands, the first operation of the campaign began in catastrophe and ended in decision. Hamilton's mountain troop was inserted by helicopter onto the Fortuna Glacier in hurricane-force winds and whiteout conditions far worse than anticipated. 2 Wessex helicopters were sent to extract them. The first crashed on the glacier. The second crashed recovering the survivors of the first. A third, impossibly overloaded, carried 17 men back to safety in an aircraft rated for far fewer. 2 days later, with just 2 SAS troops initially deployed ashore, D Squadron captured the Argentine garrison at Grytviken and produced the first enemy surrender of the war. Unrehearsed, without the benefit of any shared grounding in the basics of what they were attempting. On the 14th of May, 11 days before the main landings, D Squadron accomplished something that belonged to a different century, but proved entirely possible in this one. 45 men landed by helicopter on the moonlit grass of Pebble Island and destroyed 11 Argentine aircraft in 30 minutes using thermite grenades and plastic explosive. Sterling's method, delivered 40 years later in a different hemisphere with the same result. Hamilton led the demolition teams across the moonlit strip. The wreckage of those aircraft remains in the Falklands peat today, slowly returning to the earth, the most permanent memorial to an operation that established D Squadron as the instrument the task force depended on most. The clock was running. It was about to deliver its most savage blow. 4 days after Pebble Island, on the night of the 19th of May, 1982, a Sea King helicopter of 846 Naval Air Squadron lifted from the deck of HMS Hermes. The crossing to HMS Intrepid was 3 miles. The helicopter was slightly overloaded, so many men and so much equipment that arms were pressed too tight to the body to fasten seat belts. The pilot reduced fuel load to compensate for the short distance. At 300 feet, those on board heard a thump from the engine above them. Then another. The Sea King dipped once, then dived. Within 4 seconds, it hit the water at 80 miles per hour. The windows smashed on impact. The fuselage filled immediately. In the darkness under the surface, in water cold enough to incapacitate within minutes, men who had passed the world's most demanding selection and served together for years found themselves fighting for a pocket of air and a single open hatch. Mick Williams, 21 years old, G Squadron, the only member of his troop to survive, described what followed. It was strangely calm and surreal in this cocoon of blackness and muffled sound. And then everyone's survival instinct kicked in, and men who had been soldiers together for years fought each other desperately, trying to reach that tiny air pocket. He held on to the body of a friend he knew was already dead to keep himself upright in the dark. He said 25 years later that he wishes he could erase that memory. He has not been able to. 9 men escaped before the helicopter slipped below the surface. 22 were killed. 18 of the dead were SAS. Among them were both squadron sergeant majors of D and G Squadron, the most experienced men in both units, the institutional foundation of the regiment's 2 operational squadrons, gone in 4 seconds on a 3-mile crossing in calm water. The probable cause was a black-browed albatross, wingspan of 8 feet, drawn into the engine. Bird feathers were found on the surface where the helicopter went in. The cause has never been definitively established. Corporal Mark Aston, known throughout the regiment as Splash, was one of the 9 survivors. He was pulled from the South Atlantic with hypothermia severe enough to render him briefly unconscious and a suspected broken neck. He was evacuated to the hospital ship SS Canberra. Back on HMS Fearless, where D Squadron was concentrated, men had begun informally redistributing his personal effects. When Aston subsequently escaped the Canberra through a hatch in the hull, against medical orders, against all reasonable self-interest, with a suspected fracture in his cervical spine, and made his way back to his unit, the first words addressed to him were, "We were about to start auctioning your kit." The Argentine command in Stanley had monitored the Sea King going down. By any military calculation, D Squadron had now lost a generation of its best men to an accident that had nothing to do with Argentine capability. They believed the squadron was effectively finished as a fighting force. What happened in the next 48 hours was their answer. The 21st of May, Operation Sutton, 8,000 British troops went ashore at San Carlos Water on the western coast of East Falkland. The Argentine Air Force responded with ferocity. HMS Ardent sunk, multiple ships damaged, 49 men killed on the first day of the landings. The beachhead was established. What most accounts of San Carlos do not adequately explain is what D Squadron was doing while those landings were in progress. Depleted by 18 dead and multiple wounded, with some survivors still managing injuries from the crash 2 days before, D Squadron had flown to the Darwin and Goose Green area and launched a full diversionary assault on the Argentine garrison there. Machine guns, mortars, light anti-tank weapons, and naval gunfire, putting down such a concentrated and unexpected volume of fire that Argentine commanders in Stanley were told the British landing was at Darwin. 20 miles north, the actual assault proceeded largely uncontested on land. The squadron had lost 18 men on the 19th of May. By the 21st, it was generating deliberate deception at scale. The Argentine command was looking south when the ships were unloading north. 4 days later, the war changed its shape in a way from which it never recovered. The 25th of May was Argentina's National Day. 2 Argentine naval strike fighters launched from the mainland and put 2 Exocet missiles into the container ship SS Atlantic Conveyor. 12 men were killed. The ship burned for 3 days and sank under tow. The physical inventory of losses was substantial. Supplies, equipment, tenting for 10,000 men. The loss that mattered most was invisible until the smoke cleared. 3 Chinook heavy-lift helicopters and 6 Wessex helicopters burned with the ship. 1 Chinook, call sign Bravo November, had been flown off beforehand and survived. A single helicopter. The plan for the British advance across East Falkland had been built around the assumption that Chinooks would ferry troops across 50 miles of roadless peat moorland, keeping them fresh for battle and bringing artillery forward at scale. A single Chinook could carry what 85 Sea King sorties would be required to move. Without those 3, the entire geometry of the land campaign collapsed. Paratroopers and Royal Marines would walk, carrying 80-pound loads, across ground with no roads, no shelter, and weather that arrived as blowing snow and freezing rain without announcement. This was the Great Yomp, celebrated rightly as a feat of physical endurance, but the cascade of consequences from the Atlantic conveyor's sinking eventually included 56 men dying at Bluff Cove, because there was no longer an adequate means of moving troops by air to where they needed to be. Brigadier Thompson was revising his entire advance plan when, from the weeks of accumulated G Squadron intelligence, one report presented itself with sudden new urgency. Mount Kent, largely undefended. The commanding height above Stanley, overlooking every approach route to the Argentine defensive positions. If D Squadron could reach it first and hold it until conventional forces could be flown in, The British would control the ground from which the final battle would be fought. If the Argentines recognized the gap their own redeployments had created and moved to fill it, the approach to Stanley would be defended from above by soldiers already in prepared positions. Two forces were heading toward the same piece of ground. Neither yet knew what was waiting. The same night, Argentine missiles were sinking the Atlantic conveyor. The first reconnaissance element of D Squadron climbed into a helicopter and flew east. Not toward safety, not toward rest. Deep into occupied territory, toward a mountain that G Squadron had found empty and that the Argentine High Command was about to realize it could not afford to leave that way. The rest of D Squadron arrived 2 days later, on the 27th of May. Major Aldo Rico commanded the 602nd Commando Company, Argentina's elite volunteer special forces. Night-trained, professionally equipped men who had enlisted specifically for this kind of warfare. They were not conscripts. Rico's orders were to seize Mount Kent and the surrounding peaks and hold them until conventional reinforcements could be helicoptered in. Elements of the 601st National Gendarmerie Special Forces Squadron would follow. Once the high ground was Argentine, the approach to Stanley would be defended from above. What Rico did not know was that the ground he had been sent to seize was already occupied by the men who had destroyed 11 aircraft on Pebble Island 11 days earlier. D Squadron settled into the terrain. The concealment techniques that G Squadron had used for weeks across this same landscape were applied immediately. Delves was operating without adequate maps, without geospatial intelligence, without any capacity for rapid reinforcement from the beachhead. His squadron had wounded men, others still suboptimal after the Sea King crash, and equipment designed primarily for NATO's Central European theater. Most of his men had not known where the Falklands were when Argentina invaded. They had the doctrine, the training, and 40 years of institutional memory about what happened when small teams of highly trained men went somewhere they were not supposed to be able to reach. On the night of the 29th to 30th of May, Captain Andres Ferrero's 3rd Assault Section of the 602nd Commando Company moved through darkness toward the summit of Mount Kent and ran into D Squadron's air troop on the slopes below. The contact was brief and violent. First Sergeant Raimundo Viltes was badly wounded and left behind as the Argentine section withdrew, abandoning equipment that Rico later recovered with considerable displeasure. The SAS sustained 2 wounded and 1 man with a broken hand. Air troop was driven back initially, but regrouped and held the summit. The 30th of May brought converging actions on the mountain. Argentine reinforcements were attempting to reach Rico's stranded patrols by helicopter. A Royal Air Force Harrier, responding to a call for air support from D Squadron, attacked the eastern slopes at low level and was hit by small arms fire. The pilot ejected and was recovered from the sea within 10 minutes. At roughly the same time, a shoulder-fired Stinger missile launched by an SAS trooper brought down an Aerospatiale Puma that was inserting Argentine Special Forces. 6 Argentine National Gendarmerie soldiers were killed in the wreckage. The Argentine resupply attempt collapsed under fire from men who were themselves being fired on and receiving nothing in return. That night, Captain Gavin Hamilton's mountain troop spotted the 2nd Assault Section of the 602nd Commando Company emerging from their hides under cover of darkness to withdraw. Hamilton's troop opened fire immediately and heavily. The Argentines suffered no casualties in the exchange, but Sergeant Vicente Alfredo Flores knocked himself unconscious, falling across rocks in the dark, and was captured. The section that had been trying to secure the summit was gone. Mountain Troop had driven them off. At approximately the same moment, on the lower slopes below the summit, K Company of 42 Commando Royal Marines was arriving by helicopter under Captain Peter Babington. The Marines had been told they were landing on ground the SAS had secured. They landed into the sound of a firefight in progress across the slopes above them. They spread out, took cover, and waited. After the fire died down, a figure came out of the darkness toward them. Major Cedric Delves. He told them all was well. Brigadier Thompson stated afterward that it was fortunate he had ignored explicit direction from Northwood headquarters that reconnaissance of Mount Kent before 42 Commando's insertion was superfluous. Had D Squadron not been established on that ground, Argentina's special forces would have been in position above the landing zone when the Marine helicopters arrived. Night descent, unknown terrain, trained soldiers with prepared positions above. Thompson's own reckoning on the result was direct. Heavy casualties on men and helicopters before a single Marine had cleared the aircraft. The British assault on Stanley would have faced mountains already fortified rather than high ground already British held. That is not a footnote. That is the reason the final battle went the way it did. The 31st brought the last Argentine attempt to retake the position. Major Mario Castañeda's 601st Commando Company advanced on jeeps and motorbikes toward the mountain to reach Rico's stranded patrols. Mortar fire stopped them in the field below the summit. Castañeda was wounded. His drill sergeant was wounded. The attempt ended there and did not resume. By the 1st of June, Mount Kent was secured. D Squadron had held a position deep in occupied territory against Argentina's best-trained volunteers for 6 days at depleted strength, with 4 wounded and no combat dead. The only British death in the SAS operations at Mount Kent was not caused by Argentine fire. On the night of the 2nd of June, an SBS patrol strayed into the designated SAS area near Teal Inlet and was misidentified in the dark. Sergeant Ian Nicholas Hunt, known to his comrades as Kiwi, was killed. The sole British fatality in the defense of the mountain, and the one the official record handles most quietly. A failure of coordination between 2 units operating in overlapping ground, corrected afterward at the cost of 1 man's life. Drop a comment below with the word pilgrims if you have made it this far, because what comes next is the part of this story that most people who know the Falklands War have never been told. After Mount Kent was secured, Hamilton did not rest. On the night of the 21st of May, the same night British troops were landing at San Carlos, Hamilton had already led the surviving remnant of his troop in the Darwin diversion, doing this after half his troop had been killed in the Sea King crash the previous day. His military cross citation notes the fact without elaboration. After Mount Kent, when other elements of D Squadron rotated back toward the beachhead, Hamilton continued operating. He captured an Argentine prisoner after a firefight when an enemy patrol advanced on their position. The following night, his troop held off another attack, covering the Royal Marines' reinforcement flight. The day after, his troop ambushed a second Argentine patrol and captured 5 men, 3 of them wounded. The 5th of June, 1982. Hamilton was inserted as commander of a 4-man patrol onto West Falkland, tasked with observing Argentine activity at Port Howard. The patrol established an observation post on high ground at a ridge called Many Branch Point, 2,500 meters from the Argentine positions below. For 5 days they watched and reported precise intelligence on Argentine dispositions transmitted back to headquarters from a distance at which individual movement in the settlement was visible. The morning of the 10th of June, 1982, troops of the 601st Commando Company closed on the position from multiple directions simultaneously. No reinforcement was available. Every withdrawal route was under direct observation by the encircling force. Hamilton looked at what his patrol had and made his decision. He ordered Corporal Roy Fonseca to move first. Then he turned and initiated a firefight. What followed is recorded through the accounts of the Argentine soldiers who were there. Hamilton was wounded in the back. He continued firing. He drew every weapon in the encircling force onto his own position. Fonseca ran. Hamilton kept firing. Shortly afterward, Hamilton was killed. He was 29 years old. The Argentine garrison at Port Howard buried him with full military honors. Colonel Juan Ramon Mabragana, the Argentine commander, told British interrogators after the surrender, "The most courageous man I have ever seen." He asked formally that the British award Hamilton a gallantry decoration. The officer who had ordered his men to surround and kill Hamilton requested that the country which had sent him recognize what he had done. Hamilton received the Military Cross posthumously, the first time in the decoration's history it had been awarded posthumously. At the investiture at Buckingham Palace, his widow Vicky, his sister Jane, and a fellow officer attended a private audience. The Queen had clearly read the citation in full. She told them quietly that she was surprised it was not a higher award. Jane Hamilton recalled that the Queen had tears in her eyes when she spoke. 4 days after Hamilton died, on the 14th of June, 1982, General Mario Menendez surrendered all Argentine forces on the Falkland Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Rose, commanding officer of 22 SAS, who had been at the center of the campaign from the beginning, flew by helicopter into Port Stanley and negotiated the terms. 74 days after the invasion, the war was over. The official histories of the Falklands War have treated the SAS role with a particular form of omission, not denial exactly, but reduction. The G Squadron patrols receive a paragraph. Those that lay invisible for 28 days in holes in frozen ground and built the intelligence architecture on which every subsequent operation depended. The Battle of Mount Kent, the only engagement in the entire conflict fought primarily between British and Argentine special forces, the battle that secured the ground from which the assault on Stanley was launched, appears as a footnote in most accounts. It was not a footnote. It was the reason the final battle was possible. Consider the arithmetic. D Squadron arrived at Mount Kent on the 27th of May. The 602nd Commando Company arrived 2 days later. Had the Argentine forces moved 2 days sooner? Had their aircraft been available earlier? Had their response to the intelligence gap been fractionally faster? They would have been established on the summit when the Marine helicopters descended. Night, confusion, a strange landing zone, trained soldiers with prepared positions above. From that outcome, the path to Stanley runs through a far harder and more costly fight. The British assault on the final defensive perimeter becomes something that the official histories would have spent many more paragraphs describing. The men who prevented it had lost 18 of their number in a helicopter crash 11 days before they arrived on the mountain. They went back into action 48 hours after the crash. They held a position deep in occupied territory for 6 days without adequate maps, in uniforms designed for a different war in a different climate, against professional soldiers of comparable quality. Corporal Mark Aston, who had escaped a hospital ship with a suspected broken neck, to be among them, was there on the mountain with the men whose kit had been distributed at his presumed death. The Argentine command had concluded D Squadron was finished. The regiment's answer to that conclusion was Mount Kent. Cedric Delves wrote in his memoir that he believed the Falklands was one of those rare instances when stronger spirit and better knowledge were able to overcome an opponent's more considerable quantities of material. He was writing about the campaign entire. He could equally have been writing about one specific morning near the end of it. Standing on Murrell Heights, looking down into Stanley after the last night's operations, he reached instinctively for the presence of his squadron sergeant major, the man who had been at his side through every operation since April, and found the ground beside him empty. His sergeant major had been lost in the helicopter on the 19th of May, on a 3-mile crossing in calm water, in the dark. He would not be there again, for Delves said it was the moment the full cost of the campaign finally arrived, not during any of the fighting, but in that quiet second after the shooting was over, looking for someone who was gone. The Lady Elizabeth still sits in Whalebone Cove in Stanley Harbor, rusting in the position she has occupied since 1936, carrying in her corroded hull the memory of men who made her an observation post. The burned frames of the Pebble Island aircraft lie in the peat, returning slowly to the earth. And on a hillside above Port Howard, in a small cemetery with a white fence, a grave is tended by the residents of the settlement, people who were never asked to tend it and who have never stopped. The man buried there was 29 years old. The enemy commander who ordered his death also asked that his courage be formally recognized by the nation that sent him. There is a verse inscribed at the base of the clock tower at the SAS barracks in Hereford, drawn from a poem by James Elroy Flecker. "We are the pilgrims, master. We shall go always a little further. It may be beyond that last blue mountain barred with snow, across that angry or that glimmering sea." The men whose names are on the clock failed to beat it. The men whose names are not there kept walking. Now you know. Tell me in the comments if you had ever heard of the Battle of Mount Kent before today. Because the official histories gave it a footnote, and the men who fought it deserved to be known. And the Argentine officer who buried one of them with full honors and asked that his government recognize what he had witnessed, understood something about what happened on that mountain that the written record has never quite managed to say. The clock is always running. The pilgrims keep going.